So we are recording our Transition Tuesday, so just keep that in mind when you're talking about your individual child's IEP or any information. It is being recorded, and just be cognizant of any information that you don't want to be shared, then don't say it. So I want to thank you all. And tonight we have Amanda Pickett from the State Department of Education, our colleague and friend. And welcome, Amanda, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. First, I just want to thank you to everybody who's joined this call. I work at the State Department of Ed, but I think the best part of my job is being able to be connected directly to families and students. So I thank CPAC for this opportunity, and I thank you all for being here tonight, because as much as I'm here as a resource to you, you keep me grounded in the work, and I really value the insights that you share and appreciate the perspectives that you bring to the room. So thank you so much. I am the contact at the State Department of Ed for bullying, climate, and culture. And I have been at the department for 2.5 years. I come from a social work background. I used to work at CERC doing a lot of professional development to schools around behavioral supports, multi-tiered systems, PBIS, restorative practices, and equity work. And so tonight, I'm really here to share some information with you, but really to find ways that we can partner and hopefully support students to be successful. So thank you so much, and let's get started.
Okay. And I forgot, I did not introduce myself because I just assume everybody knows me because I've been doing Transition Tuesdays for many years now. My name is Laura Knapp, and I am one of the parent consultants at Connecticut Parent Advocacy Center. I am the transition coordinator, and I have several children who are IEPs, 504s. Luckily for myself, they are now adult children, so that brings its own host of issues and challenges and joys. So I look forward to hearing from Amanda, and we'll talk about transition. There you go.
Perfect. So you can, are you changing slides for me, Laura?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. You can move on again.
Okay.
So
again,
I want to, perfect.
Zoom is very, very glitchy, so just
we'll be patient tonight. It looks like only one of the slides is advanced, Laura, too. So
yep,
I just will be patient. Thank you. So just to set the context, I think it's important for everybody to kind of think about Connecticut and think about who we are working with. And then I'm going to encourage you all to do a little homework if this has not been shared as a resource with you all. So this is data from the State Department of Ed's public website. It's called EdSite. In a little while, I will put a direct link in the chat for all of this information. And I think it's important for folks to know our high needs student population, which you see broken down here on the right. We consider high needs students with disabilities, English language learners, and students who are eligible for free or reduced lunch. And that population is increasing. As well as our student population as a total. So I think it's important to think about how we support all students in learning environments, and the important piece around ensuring that our most impacted students are particularly planned for. So just some information around the data of Connecticut. And again, you see the website here. I encourage you all to go on this website. You can access report cards, you can find your district, you can look at your school. Student data and teacher data is available. So all staff data, their attendance, race, ethnicity, all of that is also part of the publicly available website. So I encourage you all to check it out. Next slide.
There we go.
Thank you. I also think it's important, I know we're here to talk about a very sensitive topic like bullying. I try really hard to also ensure that we center a conversation around prevention and providing supportive, positive, affirming, and inclusive school communities for our students. So my work, I am the contact for bullying, but I also support schools and districts in really working on overall school climate and culture. And I think it's important that we just quickly look at some definitions there. And I encourage you to think about your students or your child's experience. Culture is those norms and values, those traditions, those rituals. You can give me a thumbs up in your camera if you had a prom at your school, pep rallies, all those things that are really important, that folks are really clung on to. Those is what we call the culture of a community in a school. Those are typically set up over time. And sometimes the folks who have set the culture, it always hasn't been done in an inclusive way. So it's been done by either people in power, in a small room. So we're working really hard to have schools and districts think more inclusively about how we set up even our norms, our expectations, our traditions that we have in our school to be inclusive of all students. Climate is how you personally feel in an environment. So the culture is set. I might walk into a space and feel welcomed, included, feel very comfortable, where a colleague of mine might walk in and have a completely different experience. It might feel that experience differently. And that is because we all come to the table with our own individual experiences, our own individual values and beliefs. And so how we interact with environment is how climate feels to us. And I'm sure you all have your own experiences in schools and your children's experiences around if it's positive or if it was challenging. So my work is really to also set schools up for success. You are going to the next slide and you're right on track. It's important to also ground us in the legislation. So I think it's important, knowledge is power. So you'll see on this screen some really of the grounding legislation around school climate and bullying in particular. In Public Act 19-166, the definition of bullying was changed, along with some other requirements that I'll kind of get into in a little bit. But it's really important to look at that legislation. We provide parameters and guidelines. Each of your school districts has their own policy. So another kind of knowledgeable, important power piece for you all is to find your Board of Education's policies around bullying. Each district has their own policy. Many of them are similar, but that is individualized per district. So I do encourage you all to check out your district's website and find your district's bullying policy and school climate policy. You can go to the next slide, Laura. So some of the challenge around bullying is the definition. So I want you all to pause for a moment and read this definition as it stands. I will read it out loud slowly. An act that is direct or indirect, severe, persistent, or pervasive, which A, causes physical or emotional harm to an individual, or places an individual in reasonable fear of physical or emotional harm, or infringes on the rights or opportunities of an individual at school. You can feel free to put in the chat or raise your thumbs up or thumbs down. Do you have a clear understanding of what bullying is based on this definition? I see a thumbs down. Thank you, Sharon. This has become very problematic in many districts. This definition mirrors very closely to our harassment definition. And in many places, it's up to interpretation. So I'm going to share space with you as families and as districts around the challenge of investigating, substantiating, or verifying acts of bullying. The definition is not explicit. I'm sure all of you who know IEPs very well, when we're defining behaviors, we get really specific about what that looks like, sounds like, how often is it happening, for how long. This definition does not provide that type of guidance. So the definition in itself is a challenge. So I like to center the conversation instead of being hyper focused on what is bullying, what is not bullying. I always ground my conversations with families and schools around what supports do the students need. Regardless of what we name the behavior, what does the student who's being targeted need? And what does the student who's engaging in the aggressive behavior need? And how are we supporting our students? However, I do think it's important for you all to be aware of your rights under the bullying policy and legislation around how to advocate for your students and what that process should look like. So if you want to go to the next slide. And this is where I'm also helping, and I should have set this up on the front end. If we would have had more time, I would have set up norms for our conversation, done some get to know you activities. But please feel free to raise your hand, unmute and ask a question, put a question in the chat. I really want this to be conducive to your needs. So please feel free to chime in. What I have done is I answer a lot of calls in my job around bullying and concerns happening in school. So I note trends that are happening in those calls, and I thought it would be a helpful place to kind of ground some of our conversation. So one is around the bullying process. You know, I'll get a parent phone call who will say, I think my kid's being bullied. I've told the school administrator nothing's happened. What's supposed to happen? And so what I like to say to families is, first, you got to find your Board of Ed's policy. Second, in legislation, if a parent is reporting a suspected act of bullying, they need to report that in writing, is what the legislation says. So some districts have specific forms that you need to complete. Some districts, it's an email that you send to a principal. Really important that you find out what your district's process is, but you need to notify the Safe School Climate Coordinator. So either through a form or through an email. Once that has been reported, regardless if the school believes it to be bullying or not, they have an obligation to investigate it. An investigation, schools can't do investigations all the time with behavior. And so an investigation can look a little bit different than some other investigations you might be involved in. But typically that involves asking students, interviewing staff, reviewing any video footage, collecting any evidence. So if there was a social media post, if there was an email, collecting whatever evidence there might be. And then after they've completed their investigation, they need to notify families in writing if the act has been determined verified, meaning yes, this is an act of bullying, or not. That can be a really challenging moment because it can be really hard to get a letter back that says not verified. So I will share with you best practice, which is not law, but something I say to families and to schools. Regardless if it's verified or not, I say best practices that you still do support planning for students, regardless if you verify it or not. There's obviously a need, so we should be putting some supports in place for the students, regardless if it's verified or not. I'm seeing some really good questions coming up in the chat. One is, how long does this investigation take? Unfortunately, that can vary depending on the situation. So I've seen really egregious acts where there's been social media posts, sharing of text messages, where they need to take their time to gather all that evidence, make sure appropriate people are notified. And so it can take a few days, a week. I've seen others where within a day, a district can verify or not verify. So it really depends on the situation, but it should be timely. And that is a question I would encourage you to ask the administrator when you report it. How long do they anticipate this investigation taking? And when can you be informed of next steps? You have every right to ask those questions. The other question is, do you have these steps on paper? So William, that is a really great question. I'm hoping that I can tap into all of you very soon. We are hoping to update some resources around school climate and bullying in particular. As you can tell, our resources on our website are a bit outdated and maybe not the most helpful tool. So I want to acknowledge that question, William, and also thank you for it. My hope, though, is that it's a document that we could co-create with families and schools, so everybody is on the same page, and the information we're sharing is the same with families and with schools, and everybody's voice helps shape those documents. So if you would be interested in being involved in giving feedback on updated resources, my contact information is going to be at the end. Please feel free to reach out. I would love to have families directly be involved in giving us feedback on those resources. But I might have some resources, William, that's helpful as far as some big things to be thinking about in this process, you know, the major steps. So I will see what I can put together and share with you all. Sorry, so then what comes from this letter? It's either verified or not verified as an act of bullying. If it's verified, the district must notify both families, the student who's been impacted and the student with the aggressive behavior. And supports need to be provided for both of those students. So a safety plan. And I also like to, even the naming of that document, it's more than just prevention and safety. It's also what supports could the student benefit from. So could they benefit from a check-in with their school counselor? Do they need staggered release times? Do they need a change in their schedule? So really thinking about what supports are needed for both of the students. I think it's important to share, unfortunately, another piece that's what can and cannot be shared with parents. The discipline that happens as a result of potential act of bullying is not something that a school can share with you. So if your child has been a victim of bullying, a school cannot share how they may or may not have disciplined the student who did that to your child. This can also be frustrating because we all like to know that students are held accountable. I encourage families, just like I said, to find your bullying Board of Ed policy, to look at your student handbook and your district policies around behavior and discipline. And I have encouraged districts to even share with families what does their continuum of responses look like for behavior. A piece that I will share with you, and this can sometimes be hard to say, we know exclusionary discipline unfortunately doesn't change behavior. We can suspend or expel a student, but it's really about how do we teach that student that what they did was wrong, and also support that student with their needs. And I think sometimes, and I don't know if anybody has been in this situation where your child might have been the aggressor or the accused bully. And I think about how we ensure that we plan for both students and their skill needs. And I try really hard. I don't really even like the term bully. I don't believe children are bullies. Bully is a type of behavior. It's not a label to a kid. And so it's really important to think about the skills that both sets of students need. I want to pause for a moment to see if there's any specific questions around the bullying process that anybody on the call has.
What do you do if it's verified and you feel it shouldn't have been verified?
So this, again, check your board policy. However, unlike Title IX and harassment, there is not an appeal process for bullying. So what I often share with families is as challenging as it can be to not get the verification, I often ask, what is it that you're hoping to see happen? And how can we advocate for that, regardless if it's verified or not? So oftentimes families, they want to make sure their child is safe. They want to make sure their child's included in school. And so we can talk about safety and support planning, regardless if it's verified or not. And oftentimes I encourage families to advocate for that. And I've supported districts with doing that with students, regardless if they verify an act or not. So I hope that was helpful. Really good question. Anything else?
It looks like we have some questions in the chat, but I was just notified anytime I open the chat or anything, I dropped the PowerPoint into the chat everybody can see my screen. Zoom is being very glitchy. You're not supposed to see behind the scenes, but apparently you can see everything I'm doing. So I apologize if I was blocking the screen at all.
No worries. And you know what? I had my chat up, but Rachel's awesome question did not pop up. So Rachel, thank you for your question. So what are typical discipline strategies that are used on the student who engage in the bullying behavior? That ranges from district to district. So again, looking at your student handbook and looking at your board policies is one way to kind of answer that question specific to your district. However, like I just mentioned, thinking about the skill and the context of that student. So it ranges. Sometimes I'll give you an elementary example and I'll give you some high school examples. I was involved in a situation where a elementary school student made an anti-Semitic comment to a classmate. And thinking about the context of that, a second grader, developmentally appropriate. She didn't quite understand the words and what she was saying to her peer. She was able to acknowledge that she had hurt her, classmates' feelings, that what she had done was wrong, and they were able to sit together and have a conversation. There was still a safety plan put in place for both those students, but there wasn't discipline as far as like a detention or a suspension. Middle school, high school examples, it really does depend on how egregious the act is, the pattern of the behavior, and the context of the student enacting in that behavior. I've seen students who have been suspended based on what they've done or said, especially if there's other policy violations that go along with it. Students who engage in cyberbullying, if they use a school-issued device, all of those things add layers to how a district might discipline a student. But I want to be really clear that what we think of as discipline, as far as suspension, expulsion, detention, is really just one set or one piece of discipline. And I always go back to districts and also think about how are they supporting that student with a skill gap? So how are they educating that student on the act that they did and the impact that it has on others? So I think that's important. And thank you for changing the language. I will say, I wish I would have started with this. The word bullying and even the term bully has a lot of stigma around it. And good old October is Bullying Prevention Month. And I will say every year I say to the State Department, can we not do bullying prevention? Can we have a positively, positively phrased, what are we promoting instead of what are we against? Unfortunately, it's a term that is caught. But like I mentioned, and I think it's important, this is another advocacy piece, there is some proposed legislation currently in our state government around school climate. And I encourage you all to take a look on the state legislature website, because there are some major proposed changes to the law. And I think it's important for folks to think about how that would impact them and how they feel about some of those changes, because it is an ever-changing world. But linked to the second bullet point here around connection between Title IX harassment and bullying, anybody who is on the call here with a student with an IEP does have the protection of being part of a protected class. So I will share with you, oftentimes the calls that I get around potential bullying often hover the line of actual harassment or civil rights violations, depending on the nature of the complaint. So I do think it's important to know that your rights are also protected in other arenas. So that's why I put that up on as a second bullet piece here, Title IX, specifically around gender and sex and sexual orientation, and then harassment, really thinking about students in protected classes and ensuring that depending on the act and how egregious things are, or why a student is being targeted, or what that behavior looks like, ensuring that those processes are also followed. And then Carla, would you mind clarifying your question?
Certainly. So far, and thank you so much for the information. It's incredibly helpful. the discussion has been set up with a student exhibiting bullying behavior towards a student as well. But a fair amount of the time, especially as they get older, children can bully in groups or especially doing it in front of peers. So what does that process look like, please?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so bullying is not defined to one student to another student. It can be groups of students. And that's where things can get really challenging, Carla. And I wish, you know, maybe next time having a school administrator join along in the call might be a nice, helpful addition. So when there's groups of students, each of those students gets an investigation case. So like if your student is being targeted by more than one child that are all friends, those students all need to be investigated as potential acts. How the district reports that to the state can vary. So some districts have it in their own system where they can link, if there's multiple aggressors, they can link that all to one act of bullying. So it was one target, multiple people did it with one target. So it's one act of bullying with multiple aggressors. Some districts don't have that ability to link their acts. So they may report that to the state as 5 acts of bullying because they have to enter the data for each of those students who engaged in the act. So they would investigate that just like they investigate other things that happen in schools. They would need to, you know, keep track of who was involved, who witnessed, who directly said something or did something, who might have just shared it and what their role was. So that happens often. And thank you for clarifying that, Carla. Bullying can be more than one aggressor. It is not one-to-one. So I'm going to move on to the next bullet point, but please feel free to continue adding questions to the chat. Another piece that I think is important for families to know is really what is the role of you as family members or students in this process. So the first piece is really thinking about notifying school personnel whenever you suspect that an act of bullying might be happening and reporting that. Then I encourage families and students to be actively share with the school district's expectations. So I've had some families who ask for a safety plan while they're conducting the investigation. So the question earlier around timeline, if we don't know how long it's going to take to investigate and you're worried about your child's safety, when you report it, you can ask to have a safety plan while they're investigating. That varies by district to district. That's not by law. To me, that's best practice, but that is not legislatively mandated. But I encourage families to ask if safety is a concern. The second piece really comes in around after they determine if it's verified or not, and we're creating some type of safety and support plan. It is really important that families and students be part of that conversation. I've seen template safety plan documents. I've seen some where I can't really tell if this is something that you just put in place for any child who might need a safety plan. This should be individualized to your student's situation. So much like an IEP document, the safety plan or support plan should be individualized to your student's needs. And your student and you should be part of that conversation. Especially many calls that I'm getting nowadays are, there's a safety plan in place, but somebody didn't follow it. And that could be a staff member doesn't follow it. And then sometimes the student isn't following it because they don't like something that's in their plan. They might feel like it, you know, singles them out or it takes them away from their peers. And so then the student doesn't follow the plan, but then the school is like, we're trying to be safe and the kid's not following the plan. So it's really important that everybody's voice is at the table, agrees to the supports that are being put in place, and shares their creative solutions. So both students and families, if there is something that you would like to see be done or communicated with you, this is your time to advocate for those supports. And I encourage families and students to be part of the safety planning discussion.
I really
Any
like,
questions?
go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Laura.
I really like that you said that. And it's really important for families and students when that plan is being developed. If the student doesn't understand something in the plan, whether it's the language or it's a targeted skill that they might need developing, that might be better served to be put on the IEP, which I'll know we'll get to in a moment. But Amanda, if you can talk to this topic, because we do get calls. Sometimes the safety plans are really punitive towards the individual, and they do something wrong, and I'm not going to say give us some reason to suspend the student or discipline them, but it appears to be more punitive than helpful. We received many calls like that, so I'm sure you might as well. So if you can speak to that would be helpful.
Yes, actually, I saw one recently that I was like, is this a safety plan or a behavior contract? I couldn't really tell. So yes, I do get many of those calls. So one piece is around, I would always ask, how are they supporting the student with this plan? So how does this plan support the student? So oftentimes those type of punitive plans put a lot of weight on the student enacting the plan, the student accessing support, the students telling an adult something. And so I say to families and to students, does the student A, know how to do that? Can they perform that task? Will they need support with that? And how does that help support the student? And in particular, if it's around disciplinary things, like if the student does this, this will happen. I think it's really important to have some conversations around why is that in the plan, especially if your child was the target of bullying, that's concerning. And if your child, if they're putting a plan in place because your child might have been the aggressor, I would again advocate for how are they supporting the child and learning the appropriate behavior and skill. So we understand accountability. I understand why we have to hold students accountable for their behavior, but ensuring that the student is also getting the support with the skills and behaviors that make them more successful in school. So I hope that kind of answers that question. I think the biggest piece is to be involved in that meeting and to ensure that you are advocating and your child is advocating for what they need in order to feel safe, welcomed, and included in school. And you come to the table with some ideas about what that could look like. I really encourage families and students to use their voice to help shape and individualize that plan for them. And so I would love to go to this part of the conversation because I think this might be some really meaty dialogue, I'm hoping. This intersection of bullying, safety planning, and a student's IEP. So I don't know, is this how we met, Laura?
You know, it's been a while, so I'm trying to think.
I don't know. So I work a lot with CPAC colleagues, and sometimes cases we cross paths because either a family reaches out to me that's already connected to CPAC, or I connect families with CPAC. And what I think to frame this conversation, and Laura, I think, has already kind of started this, is if a student is a victim or an aggressor of bullying, needs to have some type of safety plan, and also has an IEP. And when this act of bullying, regardless if they're the victim or the aggressor, has a direct correlation to their needs and their disabilities outlined in their IEP. So oftentimes, I will get a phone call where the child might have some needs around impulse control and emotional regulation, and that has been noted by the IEP team. Now this child has been a victim of bullying, and their emotions and their ability to cope and problem solve has been even more deeply impacted. And so a family will say, well, should we put, extra check-ins with the school counselor on their safety plan, or does that go in their IEP? And I think it's really important to think about your IEP and Laura, I'm going to have you chime in here with me, is your is your federally protected document around the needs of your child to be able to access and be included and be successful in their educational environment. So if that skill that you're advocating for is a manifestation of your child's disability, I would highly encourage you to put that in their IEP.
Yep. I like to think of it is building that skill and teaching them, put it in the IEP.
Thank you. However, these documents can be supportive of one another. So sometimes we might put as a safety plan a lot of those, what I call foundational prevention measures. So for example, I'm involved in a situation that does involve a child with an IEP that the behavior happened on the bus. So they put a bus monitor on the bus. They did some training to the bus driver and they did some work with the students around appropriate bus. But that bus monitor was not because the child had a disability. It didn't need to go into the IEP because the child didn't need a bus monitor because of their disability. The monitor was put on the bus because of the behavior of the other students actually on the bus. So they did not write that into the child's IEP, but that was part of the safety plan document. However, different type of example. I worked with a family where the child was engaging in some self-harm behaviors, some other mental health needs. And there was some goals and objectives already around some coping strategies, work with the school counselor, but they did go back to PPT and relook at those goals and revise some of those supports based on what they had found out through their bullying investigation and that process. So, and sometimes they can inform each other and they might take place in both documents. Laura, anything else you would want to add to that one?
No, I think you covered it really well. And I added some examples of some goals and objectives around behaviors, just so folks can have them. Does anybody have any questions? Because I know we certainly do get a lot of phone calls around bullying and safety plans and everything else. Yes.
Hey, a quick question. So
Hey, Bill.
regarding the, how you doing? Regarding the bullying, so when you have two students and you have to separate them, is there guidance that says that you separate the aggressor and not the victim, so that we don't have to make that child go to a different lunch table or a different class or a different time at recess when all they did was be victimized at school? And sometimes it's easier for the school to say, well, this one's easier to remove because they cause less of a problem, and that's why they're sometimes a target of bullies. But is there guidance that says you don't victimize the victim again by separating them from the group?
So that's a tricky one, and that is a call that I get often. Thank you for bringing that into the space as well. So my guidance to schools is we don't want to further victimize victims. And so what could a safety plan look like that centers their needs and their skills? However, to your point, there are situations and there are times when a school will say, I can better assure this child's safety if I put some type of plan. So for example, what I will see is like staggered, they leave class 5 minutes early so they're not in the halls during transition times. Or I'm trying to think of some others off the top of my head. But schools often will say to me, sometimes I can assure that one child's safety with this measure rather than putting a different type of measure in place. Especially if there's been more than one child that's been the aggressor. Typically that becomes more challenging for a school to sometimes plan for. Also the context. So sometimes I work with districts that are very small, where as far as moving a child's classroom or being able to do some things is really challenging. However, I would encourage you as a parent to ask that question and to advocate for your child around how are they ensuring this plan centers the needs of your child and is less impactful or least impactful on your child's school experience. Going back to kind of my first slide around our definitions of climate and culture, really stressing the importance of your child feeling included and welcomed and safe at school. and not further isolated. So those are conversations and questions I would encourage you to ask and advocate for with your school administration.
So this is why I ask about things on paper, is because I'd love to be able to hand them stuff, because they don't seem to know the steps, or, you know, when I ask for investigations, as a surrogate parent, I have to do this often, and they don't really know the steps, and this happens repeatedly, and then I have to tell them, like, you got to do this, this, and this, and it would be nice to say, here's the sheet, don't victimize my kid again, and here's what you have to do. Because the Title I person doesn't necessarily, I mean, they're trained in it, but I don't know how.
So Title IX, there is some very clear guidance that I'd be willing to share. Laura, if I email you resources after this, can you make sure that everybody on the call gets them? How does that work? Perfect. Just because I'm not great at multitasking and I will not be able to find them and pull them up and get them all to you while we're on this call.
Touch my screen in case everything pops up, and
Yes. There is some very clear guidance on Title IX, so I can definitely share that. The other thing that I would share with all of you, and as part of my role, if you are involved in a situation with a district where you have any questions or concerns, or need some support, you have every right to contact me. So my information will be provided. And I think it's a great time for me to share a little bit about what my supports look like. So typically, in case situations, it's a parent who reaches out to me or my colleague, Dr. Adrienne Wood, who oversees Title IX and civil rights. And we talk with a parent about what's the concern, what have they shared with the school, what has been the response, and what would the family like to see happen. My role at the State Department of Ed is I am not the accountability person. I cannot tell a district what to do in a situation. However, I do provide technical assistance, training, and guidance to them in situations. So it doesn't always go like this, but oftentimes I will talk with a family, then I will talk with the school or district, depending on the case, and share with them, hear their side of what's happened, what have they done. And then I try to leverage relationship and share with them some potential next steps, some resources, maybe things that they could have done differently, or things that they might want to consider. And then I debrief with the parent, and then the family and the district works together on some next steps. It doesn't always go that way, and I'm sure many of you on this call know that I wish I had a magic wand just to make all of these situations better. However, there are other resources where if you feel like a district has not done what they were supposed to do, outside of the State Department of Ed, I often connect families with CHRO or the Office of Civil Rights as a potential place to go for the more of the accountability piece. But please feel free to share my contact information with any family who would like some guidance or support. And then I will say that I've built a lot of relationships with districts. I think my track record's been getting better as far as folks who are willing to problem solve together and work collaboratively. And they see the value in that. So I'm feeling more hopeful, but I also acknowledge that it's very challenging out there, and behavior and students' needs and climate and culture is just really challenging right now for schools, for families, for all of us. So thank you for your questions. And I'm hoping that I can call on you to help out when we have some guidance that needs some feedback on.
absolutely, it's important to get feedback from families.
All right, I see a great question from Wayne in the chat. Should we intervene if the school's only solution to the aggressor is to move them to another classroom without a plan to address their behavior? So Wayne, I'm going to answer that question, but if my answer doesn't sound correct, please feel free to add some additional context. If a school is willing to move a child's classroom, my hope is then that the act has been verified as a verified act of bullying, and a plan should still be put in place for your child if they were the victim, as far as what supports they might still need. And even though the child's in another classroom, doesn't mean that plans for unstructured times, transition times, arrival, dismissal. So there still might be a need for additional supports or safety planning, even if a child is moved to another classroom. As far as the child who's moved to the other classroom, this is information that the school will not share with you as far as how they support planned or safety plan for that other child. My hope would be it would be more than just a move of a classroom. That child's also receiving some additional social skill support and some other pieces. And that should be part of a much larger plan. So I hope that answers your question, Wayne. If you have additional context or clarification, feel free to chime in.
Is there a question? I hear the phone, but. I think, Amanda, you keep saying over and over again, it's really how are the students being supported? What are their needs? What are the skills being built? How are they being supported? And no matter if it's in the safety plan, the IEP, wherever it is, but having some sort of plan in place.
And so, Laura, I don't know if I think it would be helpful to maybe go to the next slide and talk a little bit about kind of what these supports or goals might look like in an IEP.
Sure, absolutely. So now it's not one size fits all. Again, it's individualized, and it's about what is the behavior, what is the skill that needs to be built, and having a discussion around that, and then planning to put those into the IEP. So this is just, what is the behavior and why is behavior happening? And that could be, there might be further assessments that need to be done, such as the behavior analysis, and even just looking at the context of the environment. And when they create a goal, it should always be when the student it has this behavior, they will do this. It should be in that sort of format. So, example, a student will implement positive skills and they write the certain situations in peer interactions through mastery of the objective. And then it goes down into given direct instruction. Student will demonstrate an application of social skills to increase expected behavior with an adult or peer, as measured by, there could be a social skill rubric, there could be other tools, it could be debriefing with the social skills group. So there's various different ways of doing it. Again, these are just examples. Okay.
So back in the day, I used to work at CERC and did some trainings around behavior IEP goals. And I would always say to schools and to families, we want to think about what behavior do we want to increase and see more in students. And so writing that goal in a positively framed way, and being as explicit about what those skills are that the student is working on. So is it, regulating their emotions in challenging situations? Is it being able to use calm down strategies, or naming those skills that they're working on to be able to be successful? And then oftentimes, which can be interesting, and this could be another topic for another day, thinking about the data collection for that. So we want to see the increase in the positive behaviors, but sometimes I say to folks to also look at your discipline or your, tracking of the negative behaviors that got you to this place, to think about how have those decreased as well. So, and this is a great example of, you want to ensure that if your child's been a victim or an aggressor in a situation, and they do have IEP goals around social emotional supports or behavioral supports, that we make those explicit ties to what is the skills that they need and what do they need to be explicitly supported in. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I was telling, when I'm working with families, I would say the behavior is telling us something. What is that student trying to tell us? What are they trying to communicate? So, and even some, looking at the negative behavior, what are they gaining from it? It could, behavior, and any type of attention could be received as positive. Yeah.
So I want to wrap up with a couple of thoughts, but also leave it open to anybody who might have some questions, additional questions or concerns. And we didn't talk about this a little bit with safety planning, with a difference with an IEP. is some schools practice around safety and support planning is that plan is good for that academic year. So if it happened now, it's good until June. And so I think it's really important for families to ask about that. And if you have any concerns about, like, you know, next year's placement, or if the student's going to be around them continuously, ensuring that you ask about that when you're writing the plan. I also like to say to folks, as we shouldn't think of this safety plan as like a life sentence, something that follows the child for their entire school experience. We want kids to be part of a safe, welcoming, inclusive, and affirming school community. So how do we gradually release the plan as well? So if things have gotten better, if the other student has gotten support and has learned from their behavior, your child's getting support and skills, you know, when can the plan be, you know, removed, adjusted, so we can go back to our typical safe, welcoming, and inclusive setting. So that's another thing just to consider, as far as if you have deep feelings about your child being around another child or their placement for next year, to follow up with an administrator, because those plans typically don't follow children from year to year to year.
Right. Do we have any questions?
Go ahead, William.
Bill, you're muted.
Is there more training where we could get be able to identify the difference between bullying, Title IX, and harassment, so that we can know exactly how to handle each one in different steps? Does CERC do something like that, or is there other CPAC classes?
That's a great question. I'm going to take that one back. I work directly with Dr. Adrian Wood. We have a lot of discussions around those three in particular: bullying, harassment, and Title IX. Our hope is to provide some updated guidance around that very soon. And maybe I shouldn't say very soon, because things are a little slow, but soon. But I'm going to bring that back as feedback to the department, because this isn't the first time that's been asked. And I think that would be helpful. So thank you for that question. And I also just want to thank you. I'm typically the question asker in space. So I love when I'm in a place where somebody else is not afraid to open their mic up and ask some questions. So thank you so much.
And to answer your question, Bill, CPAC, we do some behavior in the IEP, but it's not an in-depth training about the differences between the say Title 19 and the safety plans, Title 9, sorry. So that's a really great question, and I can take that back to.
Isn't bullying of kids with disabilities Title II and not Title IX? I mean, or am I just understanding it incorrectly? Just from my basic research.
Title IX is around gender, sex, sexual orientation, and then I should never say typically, many cases that we get calls for that involve a student who's being targeted because of their disability goes under their civil rights harassment policy. And Jessica, I see a nice patient hand that you have raised as well.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you. And we spoke actually on Friday, so you were wonderful, you and Dr. Wood. So I appreciate all the information that, you had given me then and even this evening. And yes, and thank you to Bill, who was asking questions and helping me with that, because I was getting his answers and that I needed. My question would be, unfortunately, with our circumstance, we were told that the aggressor could not be removed from the classroom. Now, we've also been told recently that, most of Fallon's day is filled with, nervousness in the classroom, which obviously now affects her learning, and especially with a kid with an IEP, it does set her back even more. She's constantly kind of, scanning and maybe not actually into whatever is going on up at the front of the room and being the lesson at hand. So this is kind of worrisome. How can we I know that there's safety plans for safety, but how do we get an educational plan in place for situations like this, especially when she's had to miss school about, a bunch of times from being so nervous and scared to actually go to school because of the situations. She's missed out on, several hours of her learning for special ed as well. So is there something that we should be talking to, the school about with like putting something in place, extra time, extra hours, or how would that work?
It's a really great question. So the first, as you were talking, the first thing that came to my mind is this is impacting her access to education, and what is the school doing about it? Whether that's increasing the time, changing the location. I would hate for them to pull your child out, because then that might feel like, oh, I'm being bullied, but I'm being removed from the classroom to spend time with the teacher or whomever. Is that a punishment? So, and that may or may not be the perspective, and that warrants a conversation. How is the school reacting and planning for the missed school, the nervousness, how it's impacting the education? Does that make sense?
It does, very much so. And, as simple as it has definitely impacted her already. And I know it was, it definitely, even though like it's her perspective too, it is looking like, she is in the wrong. And I think somebody, maybe it was Bill that did mention it, like, how do we not make the victim more victimized? And,
Right.
and unfortunately that is happening in this case. A safe place at lunch now becomes, her having to have a separate table that she was used to sitting at, but it's, it's sad. And I get it. It's about keeping, her safe, but at the same time to her, it looks like, everybody's kind of hating on me right now.
Right. And also the concern is, what I'm hearing is that even when she's in the classroom, she's not absorbing, she's not learning, she's scanning, she's nervous, she's not paying attention to the lesson, which is going to impact her education further.
Correct.
Yep.
So Jessica, thank you for your question. And I think I'm going to piggyback on Laura there. If it is impacting her educational access, I would encourage you to bring that to the IEP team. I also want to answer Mabel's question in the chat around cyberbullying. Thank you for that question. Cyberbullying does have its own definition as far as it taking place on an electronic device, cell phone, computer, email, social media, all of those places. If the act is happening on an electronic device, but is impacting the child's school day, which often it does. So it's, for example, I'll get a call that a picture has been shared with a bunch of people, and it didn't happen at school, it happened on Snapchat. But if kids are coming into school and talking about it, if it's impacting the student on the school grounds, the school does have the reason to investigate that and take action. So just because it happens outside of school or on an electronic device does not mean that a school does not have to take action. Same thing with not just cyberbullying, but I've had situations where, something happens in the community and it carries into the school environment. The school still has a duty to investigate and support students, because if it's impacting their access and participation in school, they must address it. So I hope that's helpful, Mabel. And then I see Ashley has her question up, or has her hand up.
Yeah, so my question is kind of piggybacking off of what Jessica asked. If we have a situation where our kiddo does not feel safe in the school environment, and now they are suffering from massive anxiety, and we have documented doctor's notes that the anxiety is a result of what's happening in the school, and the school is actually saying like, well, we don't have evidence of anything occurring, but they didn't really follow through with the bullying report, and then following through with what they said that they're going to do in a bullying like report, what they went over with us after. what can we do? What rights do we have as parents?
So you're saying you've reported it, they have done some type of investigation and put some type of support plan in place, but it's not being
Right, but-
followed?
So they did an investigation, but according to their investigation and things that they said they did, we know for a fact as parents that those things didn't happen. Just down to the fact where they said they were interviewing certain people that we followed up with and never were interviewed. And then they put a plan in place in these bullying reports and none of those are being followed.
Ooh. So if that's an active current case, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you kind of outside of this call.
Okay.
If this is a kind of something that's happened historically or with somebody that you know or many years ago, this is a situation where you could always reach out to CHR or OCR as far as your child's rights and how they were impacted. But please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to have some conversation about that.
Yeah, I'll reach out because it's an active current thing.
I just got a new puppy and that's like making me giggle.
I was wondering, it was almost perfect, the timing of that.
She is a pup. She is a puppy too, and she is asking to go outside.
Then I know you need to do that. Is there any other questions or concerns, things that would be helpful to clarify?
I just had one more clarifying question. So regarding Jessica's scenario, wouldn't that be it doesn't sound like it's resolved because there's anxiety still there. So wouldn't that next step not just be the IEP team, but the Office of Civil Rights? Because it didn't get, the student doesn't feel safe, has anxiety because of it. I mean, isn't that they're clearly not taking the next steps to resolve it. Is that
I would say, Bill, this is a tough spot for me. So I can't make a judgment as far as, would this be a case that the OCR would take or not, or if that's an appropriate next step. And I think that really depends on kind of what the family is looking for a resolution. I think it is important to know that CHRO and the OCR process can sometimes take some time and not lead to some immediate, next steps. And, I'd be happy to kind of provide some additional information around what is the OCR process, what's the CHRO process. But that can vary. So I'm not sure if I can give an answer on that one.
Well, I guess on that same subject, the fact that you take the next step to file that complaint, couldn't that make the school start changing some of their behaviors?
Yeah, and so I think it looks like Laura is going to chime in. I was just going to say, you never really know. It's case by case. So for example, Bill, sometimes I'll get a complaint and I'll reach out to a district and I'll get a principal on the phone with me or a superintendent on the phone with me who's really eager to partner, hear some advice, get some resources, because they want to do things differently too. And they take this as a learning opportunity. There are also times when I met with like the district attorney because I can't talk to anybody unless the district attorney is present. So like that immediately is a different type of meeting. So sometimes, and I never want to sway a parent. You have every right to contact and file complaints in any format and with any organization that you believe you need to. But sometimes doing that can also impede your relationship with the district. Which it shouldn't. There's no, retaliation, but it does provide, it does, it can impede some processes. So I think it's important for families to think critically about what they want to do as a next step and how they do that next step. And again, what they're looking to see happen. So if that solution might come from an OCR complaint, then that might be something you want to consider. So yeah, Laura, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, before I forget, because we have to launch a poll. So I'm going to launch a poll as we're talking. So I'm going to do that now because I will forget. Okay, so absolutely, I would agree with what you said. It really depends on the situation. Some districts, they hear, oh, I'm going to do a complaint, whether it's to the state, to the Office of Civil Rights, wherever. They pay a little bit more attention and then will investigate a little bit more diligently. And sometimes it goes the other way where there's retaliation. And I have been also in that seat where I was calling a district about something and it was like, oh, well, you can't talk to us unless our lawyer is present. And so it really all depends. Any other questions? Bill, did that answer your question?
Yes, I thank you. And I thank you for tolerating my questions tonight.
Oh, no, no problem. That's why we really want this to be interactive, because we want this to be meaningful to all participants. So ask any question and that you feel is necessary.
I'm not sure how to ask a question.
Sure. Just ask. Go
Just
for it.
ask. Okay.
Go for it.
So if your grandchild is on a 504, how does that change everything? My grandchild has been on a 504 and harassed by the same student since first grade. Actually, a very violent bullying in first grade that was reported to the state, where the child was going to bash his head into a flagpole and threatened him. It was very serious, but he continues to harass, even though they're now in sixth grade. But is there anything the parents can do? And for some reason, he continues to be put in the same class with my grandson. So it's interesting how to proceed, and because my grandson is afraid, and I don't know. So he's on a 504. The school district is trying to help. I think that and I've encouraged my daughter and her husband to meet with the school together, and that improved the situation. But I wondered how all of this works when you're just on a 504, not on an IEP.
So Sharon, first piece is, regardless if a student has a disability or a 504, all students are protected by the bullying law and policy. And so I would encourage the parents to document those concerns in writing, and then asking for the investigation, and then asking for a support or safety plan for the student, and to ensure that they're sharing kind of this pattern of behavior, the impact that it's having on your grandchild. And then, much like we described, kind of sometimes the overlay or the intersection of a safety plan and an IEP, there might be some interconnection between your grandchild's 504 plan and their safety plan document. So I don't know what your grandchild's 504 needs are, but that might be a conversation that you want to have together as well.
Okay. All right.
Absolutely.
So trying to have a very supportive, and I've encouraged the parents to work with the school district. But it's just been such a long period of time, and still the problem. So thank you very much.
No worries.
Zoom is brand new to me, so I had trouble even getting on. So.
Oh,
you're doing great.
First time. Sorry.
Wonderful. Yay. We had a lot of technical difficulty in the beginning. I was low-key panicking at first. It's being very
you can imagine how panicked I was on my end.
Well, I'm glad you're here. So also,
too.
I just wanted to reiterate. So it doesn't, like Amanda said, it doesn't matter if you're on a 504 or not. The bullying protects all students. And also there could be other things added to the 504, or, so definitely have a meeting with the school district and get everything in writing, because sometimes, just especially spanning so many years, it becomes he said, she said, and you can get very confusing. So follow up with any conversation with an email to say, we talked about this. I just want to make sure I'm clearly understanding. This is what we said. So this way here it's documented.
Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to end with Mabel's question here, if you don't mind, regarding kind of police reports and filing complaints with the police. I'm not exactly sure about filing against the parents. I have been involved in a situation where if there's a criminal act, so thinking of the line of harassment or threatening, or I've been involved in situations where people are sharing inappropriate photos of others, you have every right to notify law enforcement as a parent whenever you would feel the need to. And in some situations, law enforcement defers to the school depending on the nature of the situation, or they file concurrently. The school still has a duty to investigate and support your student, even if there is a legal case as well, if law enforcement is doing their own investigation and support. So making sure that you can report it, and the school still has an obligation to do their piece around investigating and supporting the students, regardless of law enforcement's involvement.
Okay.
So I
That's
put
good
my,
to know.
oh, good. I put my contact information in the chat, my email address. I will share with all of you. I typically don't give my office phone number because I don't sit at my office desk very often. So email is the best way. If you reach out to me in an email, I can schedule a time to have a conversation with you. Please feel free to share my information with any families or folks that might be useful to them. And again, if you are at all interested in providing feedback on updated guidance to the state, please send me an email. I would love to get a list going of folks who would like to be part of that feedback work and work with CPAC to ensure that family voice is at the table to shape that guidance. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me regarding that as well. And thank you all for what you do, and don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you.